Hello, I'm Filmy Cans the Movie Horse Man. If you're like me, you're probably a fan of horror movies. Otherwise, I don't know why you clicked on this video. But if you're even more like me, you've probably already gone through the canon of American horror films. And if you've found yourself at this point, you might be wondering, where do I go next? Many horror fans would direct you to Europe, where countries like Italy have a storied history of unique and visually dynamic horror films. Some might even direct you to Japan, which has an equally unique history of horror films, some of which have even crossed over stateside in the form of the J-horror remake cycle of the 2000s. But let's say you're looking for something beyond that. Something stranger. Welcome to the world of Hong Kong black magic movies, one of the kookiest and most grotesque offshoots of international horror cinema. These are films like no other, films that deal with EC Comics-style tales of passion, revenge, and the grisly consequences of messing with supernatural forces. Black magic movies contain some of the most outrageous psychedelic imagery to ever grace the screen, as well as some of the grossest and most repugnant violence you'll ever see in a theatrically released movie. These films are fun and challenging in equal measure, so let's roll up our sleeves and root around in some worm-filled guts. There's shockingly little material written on the subject of Hong Kong's horror output, from a critical perspective or even just a historical perspective. Maybe there's been more written about the subject in Cantonese or Mandarin, but I haven't come across anything, and even if I did, I unfortunately can only read English. The closest thing I was able to find was a 2018 academic publication called Hong Kong Horror Cinema, but somehow it doesn't discuss black magic films at all and instead focuses on Hong Kong's horror trends of the mid-80s and onward. Because of that, much of what I cover here will be based solely on my own observations. The citations for any literature that I do quote can be found at the end of the video. Horror hasn't always been an easy sell internationally, in part because some countries with conservative governments won't let those kinds of films be distributed, let alone produced there. Of course, that's not to say that horror didn't exist in Hong Kong until black magic movies. There were horror and horror-adjacent films produced in Hong Kong and its neighboring countries from the very invention of filmmaking. But due to the lack of information and availability with these titles, it's hard to tell what sort of reaction or impact they had at the time of release. It wasn't until the early 1970s that Hong Kong began to produce horror films that resemble what we now think of as Hong Kong horror, many of which would be produced by the legendary film studio, the Shaw Brothers. Shaw controlled much of Hong Kong's film production until the early 1970s, when due to a variety of factors too long to cover here, their monopoly began to lose its grip. Desperate to get butts back in seats for their films, and inspired by the international mega-success of The Exorcist, the executives at Shaw began turning out more horror movies, now with boundary-pushing shocking content. This wave of 1970s horror films from the Shaw Brothers would see the release of a few early black magic films that would establish the tropes to come, most notably the aptly titled Black Magic and Black Magic 2. Now, as I said earlier, horror was still a tricky thing to pull off given government restrictions on the content of films, but Hong Kong was in a unique situation. It was a British-controlled territory until 1997, and one of the results of being a British colony was that filmmakers didn't have to deal with as many content restrictions as their neighboring countries did. I said they didn't have as many restrictions. That being said, if producers wanted to distribute a film in other Southeast Asian markets, certain compromises had to be made. Sometimes it was as simple as censorship at a regional level, but on the larger scale, the self-censorship practices took place in the form of morals. Much like the Hollywood production code, black magic movies almost always end with good triumphing over evil or the bad guys being punished for their evil ways. Sometimes, as in the case of Hex, the film will end with the reveal that none of the supernatural elements in the film were real. As strange as it may sound, the governments of some countries do get offended if you suggest that ghosts are real. Also, side note, a number of these black magic movies were also made in Taiwan, which I'll also be discussing. Hong Kong filmmakers would often film in Taiwan for a variety of reasons. Given the lack of information about black magic films and the schlockier side of Hong Kong cinema in general, it's difficult to tell which films were actually made by native Taiwanese production companies or just Hong Kong production companies working in Taiwan. There was a brief period in the early 1980s where the Taiwanese government wasn't as restrictive about film production, so if any of them actually were made by Taiwanese producers, that's how they were able to make them. The Shaw Brothers may have increased production of horror films in the 1970s, but it wasn't until the one-two punch of the films Hex and Encounter of the Spooky Kind, the latter of which was the fourth highest grossing film in Hong Kong that year, that horror took off to the races. Hong Kong's horror output would ultimately follow the horror comedy trend set by Encounter of the Spooky Kind, but the brief explosion of black magic movies is something truly special, repulsive, and special in its repulsiveness. From 1980 to 1984, there were black magic movies being cranked out left and right, with filmmakers racing to see who could come up with the most outlandish and grotesque visuals. Then, in 1985, the mega-popular Mr. Vampire, following in the footsteps of Encounter of the Spooky Kind, would change Hong Kong's horror direction to more lighthearted and comedic output, focusing on fantasy elements and oftentimes hopping vampires. But that's a subject for a different video. Black magic movies would see the occasional return, most notably in the 1995 film Eternal Evil of Asia, but the subgenre has largely since disappeared. Even so, a dedicated number of fans, myself included, are hard at work to raise awareness of these wonderfully weird works of art. As with any horror subgenre, there are certain elements that appear and reappear across different films from different directors and studios. They're the elements that make the subgenre distinct. In the case of Hong Kong's black magic films, I've noticed 4 distinct tropes. Familiarizing yourself with these tropes will help you to better understand and appreciate these movies. Trope number 1, black magic rituals. Let's address this one right away. Not every film featured in this video hits all 4 tropes, but to qualify, they have to hit this one. After all, it wouldn't be a black magic movie without, well, black magic. These films are chiefly concerned with all manner of hexes, curses, and spells, and often draw from real-life folklore and superstitions. Sequences of wizards and warlocks eating guts and using corpse juice for spells might seem gross and weird, but it's even grosser and weirder when you consider that they're based in fact. Black magic often manifests in these films in the form of curses that afflict characters with horrible diseases or deformities, like the centipede curse in the movie The Centipede Horror, or the incredible melting man disease the guy gets at the end of the Black Magic with Buddha. But how do these unlucky individuals get cursed in the first place? Well, you could run afoul of a wizard who's part of an elaborate necromancy-themed revenge for hire plot, as in the movie Seeding of a Ghost. Or, they could come into contact with cursed objects, like the haunted statues in both of the Devil Fetus movies. On the subject of magic practitioners, the films typically feature wizards, warlocks, or priests, either Buddhist or Taoist, whose plot functions are to cast spells or undo the work of a nasty curse. Battles between good and evil are often literalized in the form of psychedelic laser light shows. I really love the look of old animated optical effects in movies. It's like the sparkle effect that shows up in old anime sometimes. It's shiny and appeals to the magpie part of my brain, and hopefully it will for you too. Nowhere are psychedelic visuals more prominent than in the movie The Boxer's Omen. It's the best known black magic film in the Western world, and for good reason. There are more optical animation effects in the film than you can shake a stick at, and a wide variety of delightful little puppet guys too. Trope number 2, creepy crawlies. In their efforts to shock and disgust, Hong Kong filmmakers pulled 0 punches when it came to making black magic films. In almost every film, you'll find someone who eats and or vomits snakes, bugs, or worms. Or in the case of Devil Fetus 2, frogs? Films like The Centipede Horror and the Taiwanese film The Devil built their underground reputation on the sheer number of creepy crawlies puked up on screen. It's nasty, sure, but I have respect for the actors and actresses willing to put themselves through that kind of nastiness for our viewing pleasure. That's real dedication to the art. Trope number 3, putting the phobia back in xenophobia. Remember how I said that black magic films could be challenging? Well, it's not just because of the gross out visuals. Sometimes the themes are a little, racist. I can't proclaim to understand the nuances of prejudice and xenophobia between Southeast Asian communities, but it's certainly there. Many of these films feature plots where a protagonist travels to another country, like Singapore, Indonesia, or Thailand, and runs afoul of a backwoods magic practitioner who puts a curse on them. It's not a positive aspect of these films, but nevertheless, I think it's interesting seeing cultural anxieties literalized in such a direct fashion. I mean, can you imagine an American horror film doing that? That would be like some college kids going to Tijuana for spring break and getting cursed by a bruja. Actually, that kind of sounds cool, so maybe not the best example. Trope number 4, the objectionable material. Remember how in the last entry I said these films can sometimes be challenging? Well, I've been listing these in order of the most fun tropes to the least fun tropes, and, well, we're at the most unfun of the unfun parts. Let's just rip that band-aid off. There's an unfortunate amount of unsimulated violence towards animals in these films. Much like how the controversial Italian film Cannibal Holocaust sought to shock audiences with depictions of animal cruelty, many black magic movies hold a similarly cavalier attitude toward the animal kingdom. While the magic rituals that occur throughout these films are usually innocuous, if you consider guts and goop innocuous, there's also a good chance a ritual will feature unsimulated animal sacrifice. It's true to the reality of folk medicine traditions, but I won't defend the depiction of it in these films. If that's a turnoff for you, that's completely understandable. That being said, recent re-releases of Hong Kong horror films like Red Spell, Spells Red, and Calamity of Snakes come with an animal cruelty-free option, so don't let the less savory aspect of these films deter you if you're really interested in seeing these titles for yourself. If you've made it this far and you're still intrigued by black magic movies, you might find yourself wondering where you can watch them. Well, the obvious answer is internet piracy. But if you want to own them legally, well, that's where things get complicated. If the film was a Shaw Brothers production, there's a chance you can obtain it legally. Boutique Blu-ray labels like 88 Films and Arrow Video have put out a number of Shaw Brothers films on disc if you want to own a copy. Granted, they might not be Region A Blu-rays, which means you'd have to buy a region-free Blu-ray player, and some of them are already out of print and fetch a pretty high price on eBay, but the point is, you can own them if you want, and they're going to have all the bells and whistles and new subtitle translations too. Only in the past few years have non-Shaw Brothers black magic films started surfacing in HD, thanks to the work of Blu-ray labels like Error 4444 and Vinegar Syndrome. However, since these films were independently made, they were rarely stored in proper vault conditions like the Shaw Brothers catalog, and as a result, the films have chemically decomposed or been attacked by mold, and you wind up with some really bad film damage that no amount of digital cleanup can fix all the way. And as for the rest, well, if you've been wondering why so many of the films I've featured in this video look like they were from old VHS transfers, you would be right. Most of these films only exist in bootleg VHS rips or Laserdisc transfers floating around online and in private trackers. All of these films were originally shot in widescreen, but for their VHS releases, they had to be cropped. Sometimes that means the subtitles aren't readable because they get cut off on the edge of the frame, and when they are visible, sometimes they're really poorly translated. But unfortunately, if you want to watch a movie like The Black Magic with Buddha, it might be your only option for the foreseeable future. But why is that? Well, let me get out my film preservation soapbox. Unfortunately, some film production companies of the past didn't view their films as works of art worth keeping around for future generations, and as a result, they didn't take care of the physical materials. These films were viewed as cheap and disposable trash. Even Kwai Chi Hung, the director of films like Hex and The Boxer's Omen, spoke poorly of his own horror films. Even if the filmmakers did want to preserve their films, they might not have had the resources to do so. The Shaw Brothers catalog survives because the company had the infrastructure to store their films in vaults, and when their catalog was eventually bought by Celestial Pictures, the film materials were still properly cared for. There's also the problem of copyright. Many Hong Kong films of the era, not just horror films, had a flagrant disregard for copyright laws and borrowed music from musicians like Brian Eno and Jean-Michel Jarre and popular American films. They could get away with it in the 1970s and 80s when the films received little to no distribution in America, but in the modern day, the use of copyrighted materials poses a big problem for re-releases. Music licensing fees can be prohibitively expensive for Blu-ray labels and may stop them from pursuing a film's release. It's also a challenge to clear copyright when the company that produced the film isn't even around anymore. The majority of companies that produced these films no longer exist, and it's not always clear what happened to the rights and who currently holds them, if anyone. This is a common problem for Blu-ray distributors regardless of genre, but it's a particular problem for international films because you not only have to navigate the copyright law of the US, but also the copyright law of the country that the film originally came from. I hope these films seem as interesting to you as they are to me, and if you need some help figuring out which ones to watch, here are some of my favorites. Hex is an outlier in the black magic cycle, seeing as it's a period piece and the only black magic element is the film's nudity-heavy climax. But it's still a great movie to check out. It's a riff on the classic French thriller Les Diaboliques, and it's thick with atmosphere, goo, and the brief appearance of some comic relief Ernest P. Worrell guys. The Black Magic with Buddha is an unfortunately obscure film. I think it's a lot of fun, so I'm giving it special mention here, and hopefully one day it will find a loving audience of more than just me. In this one, a guy steals a wish-granting mummy brain from Indonesia and pays the price when he doesn't return it. If that premise hasn't sold you, maybe the scenes of people getting attacked by tiny brains will, or the appearance of the four-faced Buddha who looks like a tokusatsu character, or the cool wizard guy played by the film's director, Lo Lieh. If you're in the mood for something gross, be sure to check out Devil Fetus. A woman buys a cursed jade statue at an auction and soon finds herself and her family cursed by all manner of repulsiveness, from demon sex to decaying flesh to face-ripping body horror transformations. This one has it all. The film's unrelated sequel is also a blast. Just don't let the world's most unfortunate subtitle, Devil Fetus 2, The Rape After, scare you off like it did me for a long time. I thought it was going to be a dour sleaze fest, but color me surprised when I found out it's another wacko winner with an impish sense of humor and some really stylish cinematography. If Devil Fetus doesn't gross you out enough, give Seeding of a Ghost a try. A taxi driver enlists the help of a sorcerer to get revenge on the men who murdered his wife, but soon he learns that the power of black magic comes at a deadly cost. This one is a bit of a slow burn, but it's really atmospheric throughout, so I don't mind waiting until the black magic part kicks in. And when it does, it goes into wacko overdrive. It's a one-stop shop for all your gross-out needs. In this cult favorite, a man travels to Thailand to avenge his brother, who was left crippled after a boxing match with a dastardly Thai fighter, and finds himself drawn into a Buddhist prophecy and an underworld of black magic. Boxer's Omen is probably the best-known movie of the black magic subgenre, in part because it was the only one widely available in the US for a long time. I'd say it certainly lives up to its reputation as a mind-melter. It has all the goo, guts, and animated lasers you could ask for. The movie reuses footage from, and is technically a sequel to another Shaw Brothers black magic film, Bewitched. You don't need to see Bewitched to enjoy Boxer's Omen, but Bewitched is pretty fun, so you might as well check them both out while you're at it. These films don't quite meet the criteria I set for the video, but I like them and they do have magic rituals in them, so I'd like to give them time in the spotlight. Possessed is more of a ghost movie, and ghost movies have a lot of overlap with black magic movies, so I'm including it here. In this one, two policemen are plagued by supernatural occurrences after an encounter with a deranged criminal, including scenes lifted directly from American horror films like Poltergeist and The Entity. I'm including it here because it has a magic ritual scene at the end featuring a priest who's supposed to be like Zelda Rubinstein's character from Poltergeist, and it has some really wild special effects too. I think this one's a lot of fun, and if you enjoy it, you should definitely check out its unrelated sequel, Possessed 2. It doesn't have anything to do with the black magic subgenre, but I would be doing you a disservice not to mention it, because it's probably the craziest Hong Kong horror movie ever made, and if you've been watching all these clips, you should know that that really means something. As you might have noticed by now, there are a lot of unrelated sequels in Hong Kong horror. This unrelated sequel to Hex isn't even a horror movie, it's a comedy. So why mention it at all? Why, because it has my favorite magic ritual scene of any film that Kwai Chi Hung has directed. Even better than Boxer's Omen? You'll have to check it out for yourself and decide. And also, please check it out because the finale has a magic battle with a giant statue that comes to life and spits up coins like a slot machine. That's too good to pass up. Well, that's about all that can be said about Hong Kong black magic movies. I wish there was more information available about these films online, but I've done my best to summarize everything into a coherent package. From the 1970s through the 1990s, Hong Kong produced tons of horror movies that are worth checking out. I find the black magic cycle fascinating in particular because it follows the greater logic of exploitation filmmaking of the time. Producers wanted audiences back in theaters, so they went for the jugular with a barrage of aberrant violence and gratuitous sex. Only in this case, they added some really cool local flavor, even if that flavor was sometimes a bowl of worms.